So I don't know if you guys saw this week a speech made by Congressman John Rose of Tennessee on the floor of the House.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today to address the terrible precedent set in our country 4 days ago.
It was about Trump's conviction, and he was expressing outrage about the conviction. But behind him was his son, who's 6, who was making crazy faces at the camera as the speech is going on. He later told our colleague that he was making these faces because his dad's speech was, quote, so boring. What did you guys make of this moment?
I was impressed that he totally figured out where the camera was and was mugging directly for it. He knew exactly what he was doing.
I am very anti bring your child to work day. And I think if this were my son, he would definitely lose his iPad for a day.
That was my reaction. I do feel like, having grown up in a pretty strict West Indian household, that I would actually have been murdered if I did this behind my parents while they were on national television. This is The Campaign Moment, and it's Friday, June 7th. I'm Martine Powers, co-host of Post Reports.
And I'm Aaron Blake, senior politics reporter and author of the Campaign Moment newsletter. We're also joined this week by Isaac Arnsdorf, a national political reporter at The Post who covers Donald Trump and the MAGA movement. Hey, Isaac.
Hey, thanks for having me back.
So, of course, we start each episode each week asking about what our campaign moment of the week was. And Aaron, I want to start with you. What was the big thing that you were paying attention to this week?
Well, we've been monitoring all week the fallout from Donald Trump's conviction last week on 34 felony counts in Manhattan. These are over payments that he made to suppress a story involving his 2016 campaign. And so we've been looking at polls, we've been gauging reaction from voters, we've been looking at how Republicans are talking about this, how Democrats are talking about it. So I want to dive into all that today.
Yeah, and it feels like that is the driving question that we have all been wondering about in this past week. And to try to get at that question, we actually have something exciting today. We're going to spend some time listening to the voices of some voters that the Washington Post has been polling. Folks who have been telling us how they're feeling and how their thoughts have changed in this past week since the conviction.
Yeah, sounds great.
Yeah, I'm super interested to hear.
It's going to be a big surprise. And of course, there's other stuff to talk about this week. On today's show, we're going to chat about Biden and his controversial executive order on asylum on the southern border, why he did it, how that's going to play out politically. We're also going to talk about Steve Bannon because, Isaac, I know that you have reported a lot in the past about Steve Bannon, and he's had a eventful week.
My friendly neighborhood podcast host.
All right, so let's go and start with where voters' heads are at after Trump's conviction. So just to give you a little background, our colleagues here at The Post have been calling dozens of undecided voters who are registered Republicans or who identify as independents. And we just wanted to hear what's been going through their heads, how their feelings may or may not have changed. And we're going to start with tape from 21-year-old Evan Wilcox of Traverse City, Michigan.
I mean, I knew he would be convicted for something, but I didn't expect 34 counts. And that's where I was like, ooh, that does not look good. Because if it was, under 5 or something, that would have been still not a good thing at all. But it would have been more explainable, more, possibly even accidentally, stuff like that. Now I feel I'm a little less for Trump in general, but my feeling is that we don't really have that many choices right now. I don't really want Biden, but at the same time, I'm considering him only for the fact that he can continue his policies, and that would allow him to kind of finish things that he started. And the economy isn't, doing horrible. So it's not like I'm fully against him. I just prefer Trump overall. But I really don't have a reason that I should at this point.
What do you guys make of that?
It's a really interesting one for us to start with, and I'm glad that we did, because I think this gets at what we're seeing in the polling data and more broadly, which is that this doesn't seem to have moved a lot of people at this point, certainly not as much as the pre-trial polls suggested it could. We're seeing basically 1 or 2 point shifts towards Biden at the most. I think that's a reflection of we expected this kind of instantaneous reaction to these things, but a lot of people aren't paying terribly close attention to everything that's going on right now. And so it's going to be something that's going to kind of factor into a lot of other calculations that voters make about this race.
Yeah, exactly. It reminds me of a conversation I had with a voter in Ohio, and he wouldn't go on tape because his employer wouldn't allow it. But I called him back because in October, so last fall, he had told me that he was leaning Trump, but if he were convicted, that would be a red line for him. And so now that it happened, I asked him, and he said, well, actually, based on what he had heard about this case, he didn't think that it counted because he thought it was a weak case. But the conviction aside, just given policy positions and all the other things that he was considering, he was leaning toward Trump less than before. And he was really, really undecided and looking for the debate. So there's often not just one thing that is make or break for voters. And they're considering a whole bunch of eclectic factors that don't fit neatly into what we think of as a strict party ideology.
Yeah. And I think another thing that this points to is the importance of other issues. This voter mentions the economy as being a factor. He doesn't necessarily hold that strongly against Biden, but I don't think we should underestimate the fact that people view issues like that as being more pertinent to them. So maybe they think 34 felony counts is a very bad thing, but does that impact them personally? Maybe not so much. Maybe inflation impacts them personally. Maybe they worry about things like that more personally. And so I think that's kind of a hurdle as far as making this matter. I think it does matter, but people may not necessarily see that personal connection with it.
Yeah, hearing this tape reminds me of something that our colleague Dan Baltz wrote this week. He was basically talking about how he thinks that there are two main questions that voters are weighing, even if they don't kind of articulate it this way. But one question is, which candidate is a bigger threat? And the other question is, which candidate will make my life better? And that you would think that those two things are the same thing, but they're really not, though they're related. You can hear Evan sort of weighing those things and him talking about, like, it's not good, but also the economy. How do we think about these things at the same time? And we have tape from another voter who I think speaks to a little bit of that tension as well. This is 20-year-old Shadrach Ngoku, who lives in Georgia. And let's hear a little bit from him.
I was leaning more towards Trump, but I guess after this, honestly, I don't know. It's just surprising to see him, like, if he's doing that, then what will he do in office? It's like, I have that kind of thought, but then on the back of my mind, I'm just thinking Joe Biden, like, I'm no offense to him, but it's like, he's not actually like the best, like, he's not mentally stable for most of the time. So it's just like, it's like a toss up.
What do you guys think about that?
Yeah, it's really interesting that he connects this conviction to things that could happen later. I think this case is less troubling for people than Trump's other three cases because those deal with things that are kind of more immediate, big threats. We had the insurrection at the Capitol on January 6th. Having classified documents in his possession could jeopardize national security. Those are much more direct things that could impact the American people. This is like the Trump world would cast this as a bookkeeping issue that could potentially impact an election. But this voter points to the idea that this could be kind of symptomatic of something larger, that if the president is capable of doing something like this, if they are a criminal, what does that mean for the things they could ultimately do? And I think that's an interesting argument that we could see Democrats start to make a little bit more in earnest.
Yeah, it's a bad look. I mean, Republicans are certainly spinning this as like going to backfire and it's going to rally Trump's supporters around him. And that was true in the primary. But like, if you ask them honestly, like, would any of them have preferred this outcome versus a hung jury or an acquittal? Like, of course not. I mean, no one wants to be a felon. Trump's been quite clear he's not happy with being a felon. And it does give voters pause. And especially, there was a conventional wisdom ahead of this that was basically baked in and it wasn't going to affect people. But I think what we're hearing, and this is borne out by some of the polling data that we've seen, is that actually a lot of Americans weren't expecting this, if they just weren't paying that close attention, or just because it like it's never happened before. And so we always kind of discount things that we're not familiar with as being unlikely. And so anytime you have a surprise, that has a potential to break through, especially something that's kind of so easy to grasp as like it's convicted of a crime.
That's a really great point. There was a poll before the verdict that showed just 23% of Americans thought that Trump would be convicted. He has wriggled out of so many things over the course of his time, not just as president, but apart from that. And I think that's a really good point that like people may not have totally processed this because they did expect him to get out of it. And maybe they didn't pay attention because they thought it would happen again. But it's only been a week and kind of the feelings about this are going to evolve over time, especially to those who didn't see this coming in the first place.
But it also feels like both of these voters demonstrate that any like shift in thinking about Trump based on a conviction is coming up against the immovable wall of they don't like Biden. I mean, this voter is describing Biden as, quote, not mentally stable for most of the time, which I think a lot of Democrats would hear that and challenge and say, well, which one is more mentally unstable? But it does seem like no matter how these voters are feeling about Trump in the past week, their feelings about Biden aren't really changing.
Well, I mean, Biden's got real weaknesses. Biden's got real problems of his own. And when you are running against a weak incumbent, you try to make it a referendum on his presidency. That's what Trump is trying to do. And what the Democrats are doing now, which is basically modeled after what Obama did against Romney in 2012, is you try to push it away from being a referendum on an unpopular president and turn it into a contrast. And with Trump, it's such a stark contrast, and there's so much material to work with that the Democrats are really trying to frame this race on their terms now and solidify that by the time of this early debate that we're going to have by the end of this month.
I want to play tape of one other voter who I found really interesting. Her name is Deborah Bartlett. She's 69 years old, and she's from Pennsylvania.
That trial doesn't affect anything with how I feel about voting. The way that the two that are running, the way they are behaving, that is what is affecting my whole feeling on voting. I feel like I want to vote, but I don't know who I want to vote for. I'm just undecided because I definitely don't want Biden back in. So, I mean, if it came down to it, I would vote for Trump, but I don't want to. Does he have a running mate? Well, that's what I'm worried about because, what happens if he goes to jail? We need to know who's going to be with him.
Yeah, I do feel like the question of jail time here, that's the other shoe that is left to drop, right? Like, is it going to make a difference for voters if this is a convicted former president who is on house arrest for a couple months versus this is a convicted former president and candidate who is like in prison? And I don't know. I mean, we'll find out at sentencing in July, but that seems like a real question of how that's going to influence voters as well.
Yeah, that's interesting. Historically, the data suggests that voters do not really decide based on vice president. There are some exceptions. We can all think about John McCain and Sarah Palin as being something that really affected the dynamics of the race. And there's a potential that could be the case again here with Trump. And I mean, I know that there are a lot of donors who are very interested in who he picks, and that would actually be a material factor in whether they would decide to come in and support him. So it's interesting to hear voters talking about it that way too.
As far as the prison thing goes that Martine mentioned, it's really interesting because this kind of cuts both ways. One is that it's something that the surveys that we've had before have shown could lead more people to abandon Trump. So if he's merely convicted, they move a little bit towards Biden. If he's put in prison, they move more towards Biden. On the other hand, we've seen surveys after this verdict pointing to the idea that Americans don't think that prison is warranted here. They lean against it, not overwhelmingly, but a lot of people who think Trump is guilty in these cases nonetheless say that he should not go to prison. And so I think that raises the possibility that if he is ultimately imprisoned or house arrest or something like that, would people view that as being overkill? And would that kind of play into this narrative that we haven't seen take hold beyond Trump's base his strongest supporters, that this is some kind of a persecution, that this has been taken too far. And I think there's a real question about what that's going to mean after we do get the sentence on July 11th.
And just to be clear, I mean, the persecution narrative has already taken hold, right? Trump's campaign, right after his conviction, claimed that they raised $52.8 million just in those 24 hours. And what's implied there is that these are all people who sort of felt enlivened by wanting to come to Trump's defense in this moment of him being attacked by the judicial system. So I don't know, what that number really stuck out to me in terms of his fundraising and what he could do with that money. But is that a sign that this could ultimately be good for Trump, that even Trump going to jail could be good for Trump?
Well, two issues with that number. One is we have to wait for the FEC report to see what they spent in order to make that, because raising money online isn't free. You've got to send the emails. You've got to send the texts. Sometimes you have to rent the list. And if you look at that churn in their previous filings, it's been relatively expensive. So they're not going to net that much. That said, the money probably is the biggest impact of this conviction, is that the Trump campaign was way behind in fundraising, and they've either closed that gap. Well, they're now out raising Biden month to month, and so they're either closed that gap or they're on their way to, and that matters.
Yeah, as far as how voters view this verdict, though, it's not something that seems to have created a backlash with swing voters. It's basically just kind of diehard Trump supporters, people who are already in his camp, who think that this verdict was unfair.
Mm-hmm.
People approve of the verdict by double digits. Even more think that he's guilty. A majority of Americans think that he's guilty. And so I think that there was some hope with Trump supporters that people would view this conviction as taking things too far and that it would kind of boomerang on Democrats. But we haven't seen that. It hasn't been a big shift towards Biden, but we haven't seen the countervailing effect kind of overtaking that. We haven't seen people moving towards Trump out of the belief that he is being persecuted in this case.
So speaking of jail time, there's another figure in Trump world who is facing prison time. And after the break, Isaac will give us the rundown on that. We'll be right back. So, Isaac, on the topic of criminal repercussions for political figures, one other interesting jail question relates to former key advisor to Donald Trump, Steve Bannon. This week, a judge ordered him to report to prison by July 1st for his previous conviction for failing to turn over documents to or testify before a House committee investigating the January 6th attack on the Capitol. Can you explain, what is going on here? Why is Steve Bannon potentially going to prison now for a previous conviction?
The conviction is for basically blowing off a subpoena from the House committee that was investigating January 6th. And he was convicted of that and sentenced, but the judge suspended the sentence pending appeal to give Bannon the opportunity to fight it. And he lost the appeal, so now it's time to do the time.
And how much time is that going to be?
4 months.
4 months. And he's actually the second now. So former White House advisor to Trump, Peter Navarro, is already serving a prison sentence for the same offense. And, Trump and Bannon are both portraying this as part of the same alleged political persecution against conservatives to basically punish them for their beliefs.
Well, one of the reasons I was curious to hear from you about this is because I know that you've reported so much on Steve Bannon over the years. You have been on his show because he really liked your book and wanted to talk about it. Have you talked to him in the last few days about this? What is his reaction to this? I'm just curious.
We're trying to set a date to have a deeper conversation. He spoke publicly outside the courthouse.
I've got great lawyers, and we're going to go all the way to the Supreme Court if we have to, but I want to say something specifically about the Justice Department. Merrick Garland, Lisa Monaco, the entire Justice Department, they're not going to shut up Trump. They're not going to shut up Navarro. They're not going to shut up Bannon, and they're certainly not going to shut up MAGA.
This is an American classic, like the renegade scofflaw.
That's how he is portraying himself.
Yeah, and it's part of a broader shift that we're seeing on the right among Trump supporters of turning against law enforcement in the prosecutions over January 6th and kind of glorifying and lionizing this idea of breaking the law for your beliefs or of being prosecuted.
And I just have to point out the obvious irony of, like, this is supposed to be the party of law and order that I think in what you're seeing in Bannon's case and in Trump's case, to bring it back to him, is this lionizing of people who break the law.
Yeah, I mean, those are the judgments of juries.
And in this case, by the way, the judge is a Trump appointee. So the man who sentenced him to this prison term is a Trump appointee. So, this is not a situation where Alvin Bragg was bringing this case against Steve Bannon. This is a different set of circumstances, I would point out.
Before we wrap on all this, I do just want to raise a statement that was made by Trump this past week, him talking about revenge for this conviction. And I think it ties in with the Bannon stuff because there is this sense of what's at stake here if his allies are back in a position of power and the kind of revenge that they can enact. Let's talk a little bit about what Trump actually said and why we should be paying attention.
Yeah, so we have to establish a factual baseline. These are not prosecutions coordinated by the White House. They are not ordered by the president. There's no evidence of that. They are independent law enforcement functions of federal or state prosecutors acting independently.
Mm-hmm.
But in spite of the lack of evidence, Trump is out there insisting that this is all a big Biden conspiracy. And if you take that as your starting premise, as he does and as his supporters do, then his position is, if I win and I get back in there, I'm not going to turn the other cheek. I'm going to do it right back to them. And there was an amazing exchange with Sean Hannity this week where Hannity kept offering up these softballs. He kept inviting him to just say, you know what, I'm going to be the bigger person. I'm not going to do that. I'm going to stand up for not politicizing law enforcement.
Those that want people to believe that you want retribution, that you will use the system of justice to go after your political enemies.
So, number one, they're wrong. It has to stop because otherwise we're not going to have a country. Look, when this election is over, based on what they've done, I would have every right to go after them. And it's easy because it's Joe Biden and you see all the criminality.
And Trump just keeps insisting that, no, he's actually super clear. If he gets back in, he wants to prosecute Biden. He wants to prosecute Biden's family. He wants to prosecute his political critics.
And by the way, it seems to be that those around Trump would like to push him away from this because Kellyanne Conway made some similar comments kind of suggesting that Trump wasn't really about that, the retribution and revenge. He didn't actually go after Hillary Clinton when he became president. Well, actually, he did. Look at the Mueller report on that. I think it's also interesting that we see a lot of his supporters going even significantly further than he is. So he's kind of basically saying, I have a right to do this, and it's a big injustice. He's kind of gesturing in that direction. But people like the ones on, Project 2025, the allies who are plotting what a second Trump term would look like, members of Congress, Republicans, are talking much more earnestly about like specific prosecutions of Democrats. They're going a lot further than that. And so Trump not knocking that down is certainly seen as encouraging those types of things. And it's a really tenuous and kind of fraught situation for one party to all at once jump on board with this type of rhetoric.
Mm-hmm. And it'll be interesting to see whether that continues to escalate in the next few months until November. Before we wrap today, I do want to spend some time talking about what President Biden was up to this week. He is making moves on immigration. He signed an executive order on Tuesday that would suspend asylum applications to people who cross the border illegally or between ports of entry when the number of people crossing exceeds a certain number. I think what's important to understand about this policy is that this is basically what Trump did or what he tried to do when he was in office, and that you see Biden hewing closer and closer to the kinds of aggressive anti-immigration actions that Republicans got so much flack from Democrats for during the last presidency. Obviously, this is intended to appeal to independent voters. But can you guys talk through what you think Biden's decision-making process was here in deciding to go forward with this executive action?
Yeah, it is a pretty remarkable turnabout. When Biden came into office, he reversed a bunch of the executive orders that Trump had put forward on immigration. But what we've seen in the last 3.5 years is an influx on the southern border like we've never seen before. And so that creates different dynamics than existed when he came into office.
And also like different reactions to those dynamics, right? Because I feel like I've seen in your reporting, Aaron, that like even the polling has shown that America's just more anti-immigration than it was a few years ago. But I think you used the term immigration skeptical, that like both the reality on the border is different, but also I think the audience is different.
Yes, there's no question that Joe Biden is not the only Democrat who has drifted towards more of a crackdown on the border type posture. It's happened with much of the Democratic Party as well as a reaction to that influx on the southern border. And so earlier this year, when we had the debate about tying Ukraine funding to border security, which is something Republicans initially wanted, and then they walked away from the deal, the border security stuff was like put forward by Democrats as a concession. This was what they were giving in order to get Republican votes for Ukraine funding. But I think in a way, it's pretty logical to think these are things that Biden actually wanted, and this was a way for him to sell it to his base, the more pro-immigration portions of his base. That doesn't apply today. We have a situation in which Biden is doing these things on asylum that large portions of his base are probably not comfortable with. He's doing it to appeal to the political middle, but he has to mind his base too. And so there's a real question about how this is going to play. I think it's worth pointing out that making the asylum process more difficult is something that Americans seem to pretty strongly agree with. I mean, this is like a 30-point, 40-point margin issue for the American people, but there is that segment of the Democratic Party, and a lot of it is young people, a lot of it is Black voters who are less comfortable with this. And so it gets back to this longstanding issue with Biden of, are his attempts to appeal to the middle going to turn off these voters who are already reluctant to come out to support him? And so I think it's a very risky thing that he's doing right now, politically and legally, because it could ultimately get overturned.
Biden kind of likes being attacked from the left on immigration. He thinks that that's kind of politically good for him. I mean, the Democratic primary in 2020 got out of step on immigration with the median voter. And there's been a shift to address that since then. You know, I remember actually some Trump advisors saying like Biden could never, when the border crisis started to escalate, they're saying, well, Biden could never do anything about it because he would lose all his support. And so he kind of surprised them actually with how much he has leaned into it. And they are now portraying it as, even though it's a cap on asylum, Trump gave a speech in Arizona on Thursday where he was arguing that really, if you're capping it at a certain level, then you're allowing it up to that level. And so, you know, it's
like it's still a demonstration of Biden being soft on immigration and not doing what he needs to do to stop people from overflowing the border.
Right. I mean, this is coming from the guy who killed the border deal, and has really made, other than revenge, has made immigration the centerpiece of his campaign.
And just to clarify what Isaac just said, killing the border deal, and that there was this piece of legislation that was bipartisan, that Biden was ready to sign, that would have put in place a lot of these kind of tougher on immigration measures, and Republicans ultimately decided, in part because Trump wanted it that way.
Well, and not only because Trump wanted it, but Trump said the reason was don't give them a win, don't give them something to run on.
Yes, exactly. I guess I'm wondering here, like, what happens if this executive action doesn't work? Because we know it's going to get challenged in court because the right to seek asylum is actually protected by law. And so the fact that Biden is going this way to try to limit people on the border, but in this way that's like less potentially legally firm than if he had been able to pass that law, like, will it be bad for him if this blows up? Will it be good for him if he gets to say, well, I tried to do something, but it got held up in court, and so nothing actually has changed on the border, and that's maybe a middle path for him?
It's a really interesting dynamic because, you know, part of the Republican pushback was basically, despite having spent years of pushing for changes to the asylum system through legislation, they suddenly decided that you didn't actually need legislation to do this. The president can just do this on his own. By the way, Trump tried to do these things on his own and he got overturned by the court.
Mm-hmm.
But it creates a situation in which, they told Biden to try and do these things on his own. He's now trying to do these things on his own. He might well get overturned, judging by the examples from the Trump administration when the courts overturned Trump. But then at least he can come back and say, look, you guys said I should try and do this on my own. I tried it and it didn't work. And so the fact that this border situation is still bad, assuming it's still bad, it's because you guys balked away from this deal so many months ago. It's a hard political argument to make because it requires lots of people to understand that process. And I doubt that it's going to work all that well. But at this point, the border is just such a tough situation for Biden that I think he sees that as being something that he needs to try. And then if it doesn't work, maybe he can make this argument later on.
Interesting. So we'll see how that plays out over the next few weeks, whether this executive action on immigration does get challenged in court, whether it is starting to block people from coming over the border. But looking ahead to next week, what else are you guys paying attention to? And what questions do you have about how things are going to be playing out on the campaign in the near-term future?
I'm interested in whether we're going to see a verdict in the Hunter Biden case. It's not as complex as the Trump Manhattan prosecution, so the arguments don't take as long. I do think the political impacts of this are less. This is mostly kind of a hobby horse of conservative media. It's not about a candidate specifically. But, we could have a president running for re-election with his son being prosecuted and convicted of that crime in the heat of a campaign. And I think given how that interplays with Trump's own conviction, I think it could create some interesting dynamics on the campaign trail.
Yeah, absolutely. Isaac, what about you? What are you paying attention to?
I'm interested in seeing Trump back out on the trail. He spent weeks complaining that he couldn't campaign while he was stuck in New York sitting trial. Then as soon as that was over, they promised a very active and vigorous schedule. I mean, he's picked it up a little bit, but still not every day. And just interested in seeing if he picks up the pace, but also the speech he gave on Thursday about the border was a speech he easily could have given before the conviction also. So be looking for how the language and the tenor and the mood of the campaign are shifting post-conviction and leading up to the debate.
Guys, thank you so much for being here. Isaac, really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
And Aaron, I will see you next week. Thanks as always.
Thanks, Martine. And don't forget to subscribe to the Campaign Moment newsletter.
And of course, you can find a link to the Campaign Moment newsletter in our show notes and at postreports.com. Isaac Arnsdorf is a national political reporter for The Post, and Aaron Blake is a senior political reporter. That's it for this week on The Campaign Moment. If you're tuning in via Post Reports, we'll keep bringing you these conversations on most Fridays, but you'll be able to hear more from Aaron and our other colleagues by also following the Campaign Moment show feed itself. Be sure to look that up wherever you are listening. Today's episode was produced and mixed by Ted Muldoon and Laura Benshoff. It was edited by Renita Jablonski and Mary Jo Murphy. Special thanks to Marion Levine and the polling team here at The Post. Our team also includes Maggie Penman, Rena Flores, Lucy Perkins, Monica Campbell, Alana Gordon, Ariel Plotnick, Bishop Sand, Rennie Spernovsky, Sabby Robinson, Emma Talkoff, Sean Carter, Peter Bresnan, Allison Michaels, and Alahe Izadi. I'm Martine Powers. Have a great weekend, and we'll see you back here next week.